In this video, I'm going to talk about Stephen Nathanson's essay, Can Terrorism Be Morally Justified? And so the overarching question here is, can we ever morally justify terrorism? We morally justify other acts of political violence such as war, but then have a very different reaction when the word terrorism is used, right? Even just the word is used. And so he says that our judgments about terrorism can be hypocritical. We might say that our foes are terrorists, but then our friends are just fighting in war. What's the difference? Is there really a true moral distinction between the two? And he says that we need an unbiased definition of terrorism in order to really assess the moral validity of it. So we have to interrogate our moral views about terrorism and war while critiquing terrorism at the same time, while trying to figure out, okay, well, why is it so bad? And so he says that terrorism typically has 4 conditions. Different types of terrorism meet these conditions. And so it helps us distinguish terrorism from other acts of political violence, such as war. The first condition that he talks about is that terrorism is some sort of serious and intentional. Intentional is key here. It's deliberate violence or destruction. The second condition is that it's committed by groups as a campaign to promote some sort of political or social agenda. So it's not just done because someone randomly feels like killing people, but there's some sort of change that they want to have happen. The third condition is that they target limited numbers of people when they commit the acts of terrorism, but then they have a larger intention of impacting a country or a government or a leader. So the immediate victims are not always the same as the people who are victimized. The fourth condition of terrorism is that it kills and injures innocent people or poses some sort of threat or harm. So the fact that innocent people are involved is a key factor here. However, if you look at these conditions when it comes to war or revolution, Nathanson says that conditions 1 and 3 can also apply to war and revolution. The fact that it's serious, deliberate violence, and that there's some sort of larger change that they want to have happen, even though the immediate victims aren't those individuals. But condition 4 is what really distinguishes terrorism from other acts of political violence. The fact that innocent people are deliberately harmed or killed, or there's some sort of threat posed to them. So if we're going to, as a country or as just individual moral agents, if we're going to condemn all forms of terrorism, then we have to condemn the murders of innocent people who are killed and murdered in war as well. But many of us don't do that, right? So many of us are okay or not okay, but we accept the casualties of war, but we don't accept terrorism. So if we're going to do that and not be hypocritical, we have to think of really a true moral distinction between the murders of innocent people during war versus the murders of innocent people during terrorism. And so this is where he talks about the city bombings that happened during World War II. And so many innocent people died, but how have people made the distinction? He turns to various theorists. And so the first theorist that he talks about is Michael Walzer's argument. Walzer basically says that terrorism is wrong because it deliberately targets innocent people, and so Nazi Germany was a supreme emergency. It falls into the category of supreme emergency. So the harming of innocent people during these city bombings was collateral damage. It wasn't intentional. The rules prohibiting the rules of just war theory, where innocent civilians shouldn't be attacked, apparently those rules don't apply because it was such a supreme emergency. It was such a dire circumstance. So the bombing of Nazi Germany, or the bombing specifically throughout different cities during World War II, was justified because it was a supreme emergency. But it's not justified with terrorism because it's not a supreme emergency. Well, that's kind of problematic as well. So Nathanson, the author, is basically saying, why is it okay to violate the principle of non-combatant immunity in some situations, but not in other situations? Because terrorism could be responding to a supreme emergency of genocide, ethnic cleansing, tyrannical leadership, etc. So now he turns to another guy, G. Wallace, who says that terrorism is wrong and the bombing of cities is justified because the bombing of cities during World War II was a measure of last resort, and then it was also an act of collective self-defense. It was a response to a genocidal racist aggressor, and there was a reasonable chance of success. And so the author says that terrorism does not meet all of the above criteria. It can meet conditions 2 and 3, that it was an act of collective self-defense and that it was a response to a genocidal racist aggressor, but it can't simultaneously meet conditions 1 and 4. So condition 1 is that terrorism would be a measure of last resort. And then the condition 4 is that there has to be a reasonable chance of success. Well, if it's a measure of last resort, then it's likely to not have a reasonable chance of success. And if it's likely to have a reasonable chance of success, then perhaps it's really not a measure of last resort. Perhaps you should try other things if you do think that some sort of action could be successful. So Nathanson is still not convinced. He says the problem with his argument is that both terrorism and the city bombings involve the intentional killing of human beings for a political goal. So just because conditions 1 and 4 aren't simultaneously met, that still doesn't justify one thing over another or one act of political violence over another. So he's not satisfied with that response. So then he turns to Igor Primoratz's argument, who basically says that terrorism deliberately, so it intentionally targets innocent people, whereas war bombings do not. Even though innocent people die, they're solely collateral damage. They're not intentionally targeted. And so Primoratz says that terrorists ignore guilt and innocence when planning their attacks. So it doesn't matter if you're innocent, right? It's part of this larger agenda. Terrorists also violate moral equality, the moral equality of everyone involved, and perhaps put themselves above other people or the people that they're killing. He does respond to another theorist, Leon Trotsky, who says, well, what about revolutions? Because terrorism can be morally, it can be used as a revolutionary tactic. So those who condemn revolutionary violence but support state-sanctioned violence, such as war, are hypocrites. That's Trotsky's perspective. Primoratz comes back in and says, no, let's think about the principle of double effect. The principle of double effect is that we should evaluate actions when it comes to morality or the lack thereof on their intended goals rather than the actual consequences. So even if there is collateral damage, that is not an intentional goal of war. At least with this situation of city bombings. And so collateral damage and death were unintentional during these city bombings, but they're intentional with terrorism. So then Stephen Nathanson, our author of this essay, comes back and says, well, what if the attackers on 9/11 said that they just wanted to destroy the Pentagon and the World Trade Center, but they had no intention of harming the human beings in the airplanes? Would that really suffice? Would we be okay with that? And I think many of us would not be okay with that, right? Many of us would still find them morally guilty for doing what they did, even if they claim they didn't intentionally want to hurt people. So just saying that, oh, well, it's okay to harm people during war, even if it's not intentional, doesn't really sit well with us. So finally, at the end of his essay, he says that there is a theory that does distinguish between the killing of innocent people during war and the killing of innocent people during terrorism. And that is the bend over backwards rule. So one should always bend over as much as possible to avoid harming innocent civilians. And he says that sometimes has been respected in war. And so what does that mean to bend over backwards? You're basically targeting attacks as narrowly as possible solely on military sources. And you're also avoiding targets where civilian lives are at stake. You're also avoiding the use of inherently indiscriminate weapons such as cluster bombs or high altitude bombings. And the last component is that priority should be given to saving civilian lives over military personnel based off of the idea that military personnel have consented to being in the situation where their lives are at risk. So he says that the bend over backwards rule can distinguish between morally justified acts of political violence versus morally wrong acts of political violence, such as terrorism in most cases.